You're listening to Coffee and Culture. We're on the radio on Talk 1260 and 103.7 FM, KTRC in Santa Fe. It streams at santafe.com. And I'm your host every other week. And I get to talk to interesting people, which is a treat for me. And I read books to get ready for these conversations. And it seems like as time has gone by, most of the books I feel like I have the time to read are to get ready for talking to the authors, and so it's a treat. It's a treat for me to be forced to read books because somehow books. I used to be an avid reader, and I'm less of an avid reader because my eyesight's not as good, and it's harder to do, and all different reasons, and because of videos and the internet and all these other ways to get information. But the last 3 or 4 days, I've been deeply immersed in reading the books of my guest, Gary Paul Nabhan, who I first became aware of in the late 80s or early 90s with what was maybe his first book called The Desert Smells Like Rain. Uh, and it was an exciting book, an exciting to me way of looking at culture and the desert and food and ecology in sort of a unique way that I hadn't been aware of before. And since that time, Gary has written maybe 36 other books, a lot of them about the desert and the Tohono O'odham culture and agriculture and ecological interactions and the desert and the sea of Cortez and so many interesting things. And his latest book, which is just out now, is called Water in the Desert, A Pilgrimage. And it's sort of his own sort of autobiographical, a story of your life up to this point and influences, family, relationships, and sort of an overview of the work you've done. So welcome, Gary.
Oh, I'm grateful to be here with you, Matthew, and it's a pleasure to talk about the landscapes we share in common that we're fond of.
Yeah. Yeah, I moved out to New Mexico. I grew up in the East Coast in New England and moved out here in 89. I was actually living in France for a little while beforehand. And so to me, the desert where I live in Santa Fe, around Santa Fe, was, even though it's a lot less dry and it's much higher altitude, I think, than where your books are about and where you are, there's a lot of more correlations in that. And so I was sort of eagerly eating up books about this place. Bill Du Bois, River of Traps was one. And I ran into him the other day, a couple of days ago, and he saw the book of yours that I was reading. And he said, "Oh, when I was writing my book, Salt Dreams, I was driving across southern Arizona and listening to it as a early book on tape, your first book, and that was influential to him." And so, I don't know, it's a treat for me to meet you and talk to you a bit. You grew up on the shores of Lake Michigan, um, in this sort of dune. What you describe is these dunes that go down to the lake shore that were behind your house, which have somehow some resonance to the deserts that you ended up in Tucson and Patagonia and around there, which and relationship to the deserts where your family is from, in the Middle East. And so I just found that fascinating because I don't think of Lake Michigan as a duney, deserty sort of environment.
Well, actually, Cecil DeMille made a desert movie in the dunes out there. He made another one in the Napomo Dunes in Southern California, but it was used for a lot of uh, B movies as desert scenery. it wasn't like the rest of the Midwest because you couldn't grow corn or soybeans on them. And it was left in part to wilderness because of all the marshlands that were on either side of the dunes. So it was a really good place to play hooky as a kid.
Yeah. I was reading in your Wikipedia page that after you excelled in high school at William A. Wirt High School, which gave you the opportunity to attend Cornell College. But in your book, it didn't sound like you high school was your main interest at the time.
No, I didn't really fully make it through my sophomore year or much of my junior year. Um, Never really finished my junior year and then didn't go to high school my senior year. I was suffering from chronic fatigue and I was also pretty rebellious and a lot of factors um, converged that allowed me to uh, try something else, and that was being involved in art and writing and prairie ecology for my first year and a half in college. So that was a stepping stone away from finishing high school and having to get a GED. I never went back for a GED, so I was just lucky to have a convergence of opportunities that catapulted me out into the larger world.
Yeah, and it sounded like the way that your work as an adult has really focused on the relationship between species and between plants and pollinators and people and all the different interactions was something you were really looking at as you sort of traipsed around in the marshes and the dunes, and the lake shore, um, when you
Yeah,
were
you're
a kid and a teenager.
yeah, you're spot on. I began observing some of those relations. I wasn't good at memorizing names of plants or animals, but I was more interested in their interactions or ecological relationships of plant and pollinator or nut tree and seed disperser and the animals that burrow in under the trees and
Yeah. Um, I think we might.
started thinking, well, is nature just a bunch of things, or is it really this sort of choreographed dance performance in front of us that we have to figure out because it's signaling us in ways other than words with fragrances and sounds and textures that are the ways that other organisms communicate while we are sort of trapped into words and visual imagery.
Yeah. And one thing that you mentioned in your book is when you had this accident riding a mule, um, and hit your head and had a severe traumatic brain injury. One sort of byproduct of that, even though there was a lot that was traumatic and difficult, was a heightened sense of smell, which attuned you to the relationships of smell and communication through smell, which you'd been less aware of before.
Right. I had a pretty good sense of smell as a kid, not only because my grandpa was a fruit peddler and sold spices, and we had different Middle Eastern spices on the table every day, but I was surrounded by wildflowers and fragrant trees. And then I think that atrophied, as it does for a lot of us as we get older and become more visually oriented. And then the mule, as one of my friends indelicately said, the jackass kicked me in the ass.
Yeah.
And I had a synesthetic shift that impaired my vision, but allowed my sense of fragrances of the osmocosm, scientists now call it, to be heightened incredibly. And then I started to study how um, fragrances organize desert plant and animal communities. They're really an important way, probably the most important way that plants, animals, and microbes communicate.
Yeah. We have to go to our first break. We'll be right back. My name's Matthew Chasiani. I'm talking with Gary Paul Nabhan. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. I'm talking with Gary Paul Nabhan, who is an ecologist, ethnobotanist, author of many, many books. They're nonfiction, but they're also contain a lot of poetry and just beautiful language and description of place that really pulls us into places and peoples and plants and uh, anyway, he he'll be in Santa Fe reading at Collected Works from his newest book on Thursday, July 23rd at 6 p.m. That's Collected Works is downtown at 202 Galisteo Street. And one thing we were talking about in the just before is relationships of different species and plants and animals and insects and microbes um, and there's a term you reference in your book called holobionts, which I guess a Portuguese man of war is a example of, which is actually four separate, distinct, genetically distinct organisms that live in symbiosis that we think of as one creature, but it's actually four creatures. Or the human body is another thing where the majority of the mass or the cells in our body are bacteria and other things that live in our bodies and our guts and not actually human cells. And I find that a fascinating way of thinking.
Well, I think that the 20th century, I think we're already out of this paradigm, will go down as the one where we overemphasized individuality, where in fact no human is an individual. So it's really about our egos more than what we truly are biologically, which is a community of other organisms. And we now know that some gut microbes affect our ways of thinking, and that others stimulate our uh, hormonal responses for sensuality and sexuality in ways that attract or repel potential partners. So we're now on the dawn of the age of understanding that we were never individuals, we were never alone. And there's something reassuring about that. But I have a friend that uh, studied how scent plays a role, fragrances play a role in attracting partners, love partners or mates. And he wrote one Valentine Day that um, it the girl should be reminded that they're not really attracted to the guy, they're attracted to the fragrance of their sweat microbes. And
Ah,
that's a little
yeah.
uh, tough on the old male ego, isn't it? But to admit that the microbes in our sweat glands play a larger role than our brilliance or our dancing abilities, but that's the way it is. We got to
Yeah.
suck it
Well,
up and accept the facts, you know.
takes the pressure off a little too.
I love that. I
Yeah.
love that.
My
But more,
wife,
more,
my wife, this is reminding me, and this goes back to the titles of all your books, which are about deserts and water and rain, is that my wife says that my sweat, my body odor reminds her of the smell of a desert after a rain.
oh,
So,
that's wonderful. So you must be a creosote bush, not a human.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and all the other plants that smell
Yeah,
like.
I mean, we get by with pretending like we're humans, but I've had been given names. I feel more like a changeling. I mean, some of my Native American friends call me Brother Coyote because I'm a Franciscan brother that took that name. Others called me Horny Toad, and that in their language, it has nothing to do with our uh, nuanced meaning of horny in English.
Right.
And I was called Jeepers Creepers when I was a kid because I had big eyes like some infantile animals. So I think we should not only get used to thinking ourselves as biotic communities, not individuals, but thinking of ourselves as changelings, that we at each point in our life, um, we really take on a different persona, a different mask. And we know that great artists like Bob Dylan uh, have clearly done that. That's why his biop is called He's Not There, because
Right.
he's been 45 other people over his life than who he is now. But I think that's true with all of us in one way or another. It's uh, we uh, put on and take off masks our whole lives. And sometimes that helps us grow. Sometimes we're hiding stuff from other people. But in my case, I feel lucky that it stretched me rather than forced me to hide anything.
Yeah. Well, it also seems like you've put yourself in situations that are challenging and not necessarily the most comfortable. I was just struck looking at the book, reading the books, this combination of this solitary or with small groups of people in out in the, walking long distances out in the deserts, observing things at a very slow pace, as things change around you, with the writing of books, the speaking, the activist political work, working on policy issues and stuff. And they seem like they feed each other and and help you grow and push you in different directions.
Well, I couldn't survive one without the other. In other words, part of it is that I think I am what the term that I use in the book for certain desert plants and animals, an extremophile. I think that's what I am. I love living in extremes. It's not that I'm a political extremist. It's someone who loves being in hypersaline seas where the salt content is so high that you float even when you don't want to being in Arctic deserts where they're deserts because of lack of liquid water. It's all locked up in ice. And so I've learned a lot from extremophiles. Uh, Plants and animals that are adapted to and loving extremes. And as a desert ecologist, I think a lot about how both cultures and animal species have had to do that. And that's the genius of Frank Herbert's The Dune, of course, that that's had staying power for 40 years as a set of fantasy novels that his children later helped with, and it's now a film or a second round of films,
Right.
because it's such a compelling story of how ecology shapes our psyche.
Yeah.
And so I've always been interested in that. To me, it's not environmental determinism, it's a combination of environment and culture and other more mysterious forces.
Yeah. Well, I think you write in there, that immersion in wild places leads our subjectivity to dissipate or disappear. Um, and it's sort of a shift in awareness that happens. And you're sort of out of your ego self, um, when you're immersed in this wildness.
Yeah, we spend too much time in echo chambers, where we either get self-gratification or feedback that we're cool or whatever. And when you go into a desert, your ego gets stripped down pretty quickly, not just because of rattlesnakes and heat and desiccation, but it, um, your ego isn't in control
Right.
in desert landscapes like it's not in the Arctic or on the top of high peaks for mountain climbers. You have to accept your flaws, your wounds, your disabilities if you're going to survive. But you learn something by doing it, which I call turning a wound into a gift. I have all kinds of cognitive disabilities that I hope some of those have been in the cauldron long enough, but that they've been forged into gifts, not disadvantages that either impair me or disrupt my friendships with people.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I want to talk a little more about that. We have to go to our second break. We'll be right back. I'm talking with Gary Paul Nabhan. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. Matthew Chase Daniel talking to Gary Paul Nabhan. Um, so you have certain what you're saying neurodivergence that you grew up with and you continue to have, and you're saying that that's actually a gift, and that maybe you saw it in the early days as a disability, and I see that a little bit in the way you're describing analyzing these relationships, human relationships, biotic relationships, maybe with a little distance or reserve or something that allows you to analyze things in a way that's more challenging for others. Is that part of it?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the topics, of course, that I talk about is how animals and plants aggregate with one another in ways that gives us model for community organization and mutual support, different than the nuclear family of the 1950s in the United States, where Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver sort of reified the nuclear family as the most functional unit of social organization. And since then, we've had hilarious novels and TV shows that show how dysfunctional those nuclear families really are. But if we look at other models of social organization, among the jays that fly around over Santa Fe, and see how they do um, communal care for their hatchlings rather than just parents taking care of the jays, we can imagine other models for raising our own children where uncles and aunts and best friends have as much of a role as we do as biological parents.
Yeah, and we used to have that more in our families 100 years ago.
Almost all of us had grandparents or great grandparents that lived as extended families, and we were enriched by that because we had multiple role models.
Yeah. And it was enriching for them too. I'm dealing with family now who are have lived on their own for decades and are now unable to live on their own and live, 1,000 miles away from the rest of their family. And it's a huge challenge to um, integrate, help them through that part of their life as family when we're not all in one house or one village or one town.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't think we're genetically adapted to being cloistered, and we isolate most of our elderly people in senior homes where they're out of contact with children, where being in contact with children could extend their lives.
yeah. Um, One thing you described that's sort of related to this is that certain, um, like Quitobaquito Spring in southern Arizona near the border, in the Organ Pipe National Monument, used to have village there, and the spring was used to irrigate orchards, and there was a flourishing of biodiversity at that spring, like there still is at a spring 35 miles south in Mexico. Um, but Quito Baquito was sort of made into this natural thing with no human control on it in the effort. And this is something that sort of as environmentalists, there's a movement to preserve natural places. But one thing you're pointing out is that actually human interaction with place is part of that nature at times within limits. Um, and we don't normally think of that. We think it'll be healthiest if left to its own devices and we leave it alone, but maybe
Yeah.
not.
Well, it's an object lesson that reminds us that humans don't have to run down or deplete every place that we live. We can enrich it by the way we are stewards or influences on it. Even the word steward has a little heavy-handed meaning for some people. But yes, in that case, when the Park Service took it over and paved paradise and put up a parking lot, the diversity of breeding birds declined, and we followed that for 80 years now of bird observations. And now it's being impacted by the 30-foot border wall, a second wall going up that will isolate the flows of water and possibly deplete the groundwater in building the wall itself. And that's going on right now as we speak. The Homeland Security taking one of the most biodiverse places in the deserts of North America and enclosing it between two walls for security measures that aren't even really necessary in such a remote place.
I was last there at that spring, maybe in 2019,
Oh,
and they were building the wall, the first wall,
right.
over Monument Hill and blasting that apart. And
You
um,
know it well then.
yeah, and so is the second wall on the north side of the spring?
It's going to be right up to the edge of this of the pond there,
Really?
and it will isolate traffic from the pond itself. So we have no idea how visitation to a pond that people have been frequenting for 8,000 years. I baptized my son there. I've gone skinny dipping several times there. It's did my dissertation there. But I'm the least of it. There's 8,000 years of indigenous presence there. And the indigenous people need to be thought of as co-managers of that place, not paid consultants. They have deep stake in seeing that place healthy and accessible for their ceremonies.
Yeah.
And this is true in national parks in New Mexico too, in your national forests. The Forest Service has been very good at allowing access of the Puebloan people around you to shrines and springs and all of that, and even closing roads when they're having ceremonies there. So this is a dialogue that's been going on in conservation circles for 30 years or so, but it's coming to an ebb when uh, Homeland Security is blocking off access to these places after five other agencies have always welcomed Native American participation there.
Didn't the federal government sort of do something to extend the Fort Huachaca military base along
The
the
Fort
border like a,
Huachuca military base now runs two national defense areas where there were virtually no illegal trafficking in the months before that designation. And when you call the Fort Huachuca military base and say, "Can I speak to your staff on that?" They don't know who the staff is. It's just a paper shell of the orange guy to throw people off kilter that we're in danger because we have an open border. There was simply no one coming across that border when he proposed that. It's just a folly.
right? And now it's illegal for anyone to be in that area unless you're part of the Homeland Security, or right? They're arresting people for trespassing along that.
There's there's all kind of irregularities, and I have nothing against the individuals that work for that agency, but collectively their culture has been less than satisfactory in supporting human rights and good land management. We just have to admit that it's not a secret.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. We got to go to our last break. We'll be right back. You're back with Coffee and Culture. We're on AM 1260 and FM 103.7 KTRC out of Santa Fe. It streams at santafe.com just after 2 p.m. on Saturdays and then repeated on Sundays. And then podcasts of this and other shows you can find if you go to a podcast site and look for Coffee and Culture with Matthew Chase Daniel. You can find it, or on my website, which is chasedaniel.com. Another thing I was reading about in your book is this relationship of seas and deserts and this sort of attraction you have to where deserts meet the sea. And this has to do with where the Colorado River came or used to come to the Sea of Cortez and other deserts. And then I was reading about smelts
Lake Michigan, yeah.
in Lake Michigan that and salmon in the Pacific Northwest, where they're bringing this huge amount of nutrient abundance and nitrogen from the ocean or the lake inland that then feeds the forest and the inland thing. And it's because
Yeah.
we often are thinking of rivers bringing stuff out of the mountains and the forest into the sea, but it's actually going both ways.
That's right. And I'm, preoccupied by water, of course, because we're in a water limited environment here in the Southwest. But we now have more than 50 great rivers of 1,000 miles or more that no longer reach the sea. They have so many dams on them. The Rio Grande is overtapped, and there's been water wars. And just 2 months ago, there was a settlement against New Mexican farmers that have to retire their farmland so that Mexican and Texas farmers of jalapenos uh, get sufficient water that they were guaranteed by treaties. And the Colorado River, where I live, has similar problems to the Rio Grande, where we're facing rationing that's forced abandonment of about 150,000 acres of farmland in Arizona and forced farmers to use more groundwater. And the groundwater depletion in Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, and Southern California is as serious as the depletion of rivers. What's worse is that these data centers for AI and other technologies are now competing with cities and agriculture for scarce water in the Southwest. And I think we're going to see a paradigm shift or collapse that we just can't keep on growing food the way we have or using water not for food but for cotton and alfalfa that are extreme users of water. And we can't keep on shifting the presence of corporations that compete for water with the food security of our states indefinitely just because land is cheap in the desert. They keep on being placed here, but there's not enough water for all the tech centers for AI that are being proposed for Arizona and New Mexico. So how do we deal with that? And I think we have to go back to what the ancients in this region had, a water ethic where you look at what are the most regenerative uses of water rather than the highest dollar uses over a short period of time that bankrupts water and energy, of course, because water and energy production in the Southwest are hits to the hip. So we're seeing the collapse of modern agriculture in the Southwest after less than 140 years of high-end production subsidized by everyone else in the country. And we're going to have to come back to an agriculture that looks in ways much like what the Puebloan peoples in New Mexico practice, but using appropriate technologies to go along with it. I'm not a retro guy, but I don't think we should throw out all the wisdom of how to live in the desert that's been accrued over 8,000 to 14,000 years. So we're really at a turning point, and more wars are going to be fought over water scarcity than any other factor within the next quarter century. We see that in what's happening in the Middle East right now. So if we want peace in the world, we need to learn how to become better allies and share water rather than fighting over it. And that means that we have to reduce our own uh, uh, insatiable demand for certain goods, and in some cases, our greed, which is a driver of a lot of things that are wrong with our country, and face that head on.
Yeah, that's a very important and big thing to take on. Um, I wish there were simple solutions to that because it's the collective and it's the individuals who make up the collective who have that
But
greed.
so many people in your backyard have shown me that taking little steps towards that, the permaculture people and the tribal farmers and the greenhouse growers and so many other people are simply doing what they can in their own way to move towards a healthier way of using resources that brings well-being to our communities. It's not that we're impoverished by conserving water. If we do it right, it enriches our lives.
Yeah.
So it's what we want out of life that matters.
Yeah. And I think there could be technologies too for like AI data centers that need to use water. They're using water to cool their servers or whatever,
That's
but that
right.
doesn't necessarily have to evaporate and disappear. That could be condensed and reused. It could be a closed system somehow. I don't have
No,
that.
absolutely. Absolutely. So we're in a cultural shift right now. We all know that. And when the old paradigms drop, they go down with a big crash and a lot of noise and bad smells. And that's what's happening in America right now.
Yeah. And I think you talk about some people call them related to paramedics, para-ecologos, um, sort of emergency ecologists who are on the ground in Mexico, among the people you were working with down there. That there's a increased awareness of that in the last 30 years, 40 years, and maybe
Yeah,
even more
everyone in
now.
our society values paramedics. I have three members of my family that have been frontline health professionals, but we need that for our environmental health now. And that's why we started one of the first para-ecologist programs for lay people that want to be on those front lines in their communities.
Yeah. So here, this is a little off topic, but so last time I did this show, I interviewed Jack Leffler, who I know you know,
He's
and
my big brother.
yeah, it was his 90th birthday a couple days ago on Saturday.
I called him up.
Good. Um, and before that, Arthur Z, who is a poet
Oh,
and is now the poet laureate of the United States. And
and a very fine friend and man, too. I just adore Arthur as well.
so all three of you in your books or in the things I've read mention Nanao Sakaki, who is a
Oh,
Japanese poet who spent time sort of wandering poet, somewhat mythical figure in northern New Mexico. So I just wanted to throw that name out and see if you had
yeah, I
anything.
was just with Nanao's extended family, Gary and Kai and Gen Snyder, and up in Nevada City, California. And Nanao used to stay with us on his way between Santa Fe and California. And my little kids thought he was a magician. He would do acrobatics and sleight of hand tricks, and they just loved him like they loved no other adult visitor that came to us. But of course, he had the brilliant line that goes back in Zen teachings for millennia, break the mirror. You know, that we don't need to look at ourselves in the mirror. We need to break the mirror and open ourselves to all the other lives around us rather than focusing on ourselves. So Nanao is a hero of mine, just like he is to Arthur and Jack.
That's wonderful. I think that's a good place to stop. We're out of time, and let's all break the mirror and pay attention to the world around us and reduce our greed and egos a little bit and be a part of the web of interconnectedness that is all around us.
Well, thank you for your kindness and all of your insights. Those were thoughtful questions, and I'm just delighted to have this dialogue with you. And so, blessings to you and your whole community.
Thank you. And come see Gary Paul Nabhan at Collected Works on Thursday, July 23rd, 6 p.m., 202 Galisteo Street, or you can go to collectedworksbookstore.com to find out more info. All right,
And
take care.
I'll be coming as a lizard, by the way.
Oh, yeah. So if
We
you
had
don't see him,
changed
look
them.
for the lizard.
Yeah, look for the lizard, okay?
Okay.
Take care. Bye
All
bye.
right, you too. Bye.